Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today we are going to be looking at the false mind-matter dichotomy and why matter is an abstraction. This is, of course, brought to you by Cal Allender. So first, we need to define our terms. So consciousness proper is mental activity is conscious if and only if there is something, anything, it is life to have such mental activity in and of itself. And then the mind would be the thing which experiences mental activity in and of itself. And then matter would be physical, non-mental ontology outside and independent of mind. And so those that believe in matter either believe that everything is reducible to matter, which would be the physicalist, or mind is coexistent with matter, but matter is still outside and independent of consciousness. This would be, of course, dualism. So we need to understand the mind-matter distinction. So the mind-matter distinction is used to understand how the mind and matter interact. There are many different models and views on how this takes place, but there are ways one can actually avoid this distinction. So a physicalist can dismiss the distinction by entirely arguing that the mind is simply an illusion, and thus they would actually reject the existence of the mind. This is, of course, attempted by eliminative materialists. A dualist, on the other hand, cannot dismiss the distinction, since their ontology requires both mind and matter to be independent from each other. However, from an idealist perspective, I argue that one can dismiss the distinction by simply rejecting the existence of matter. And so we're going to get more into this. So physicalism and idealism are seen to be the mirror views about the world. One claims all is physical and independent of consciousness, whereas the other claims that all is mental and is in consciousness. My foundational assumption is that what is concrete is what we consider to be real. So whatever concreteness tells us about the world is our starting point. Concreteness is a quality of experience, since it's the life world of our experiences, and so therefore it would be mental. And so any other conclusion other than it being mental requires properties that are not experienced through our minds, and therefore they are just an abstraction. And so physicalism requires the additional assumption of a world outside concreteness and experience, and therefore requires something outside our direct experiences as well as outside consciousness. Now, one might object that physicalism must make those assumptions to explain the world. However, any robust ontology must entail something beyond our awareness and direct experiences, since we need to explain why we all live in the same shared world and why we cannot change its natural laws. We know that consciousness is a sole ontological, undeniable ontological class and is the primacy of existence. So while physicalism proposes a fundamental new ontology beyond consciousness, idealism just expands the boundaries of consciousness without adding a new ontological category. And so therefore, in terms of epistemic cost, and dualism have a higher cost, since they add the abstraction of matter, since matter, again, is an additional new ontological category outside of consciousness. And so what about epistemic symmetry? Well, when two concepts are symmetric, it means that knowledge of one implies knowledge of the other. Like if I know my phone number, then I know what my phone number is not. Likewise, we know that the hard problem of consciousness and explaining how the mental can be reduced to the physical. But because of this, we know that there is no problem with saying that the physical reduces to the mental. And so the dichotomy between matter and mind actually comes from language and not from reality. What we call matter is simply the extrinsic appearance of mind. Since matter can be entirely reduced to mind, so then the matter is actually identical to mental states. These mental states would of course be the thoughts of universal consciousness, so therefore they would exist independent from us, but they wouldn't exist independent from consciousness as its own ontology. So therefore, there is no mind-matter dichotomy. We simply do not know matter, which is independent of consciousness, in the same way that we know about our own minds. And so, how does language actually play a role in dichotomies? Well, language presupposes something that has knowledge of the language, and likewise, knowledge depends on the knowledge of our conscious experiences. In other words, you can't have language without first having it in mind. Therefore, contrary to what some physicalists say, which in this case would be the eliminative materialist, mental categories are not a byproduct of language, but rather material categories, which is any ontology outside the ontology of consciousness, is a byproduct of language. This makes, of course, matter an explanatory abstraction. And so the fundamental problem with physicalism is that it tries to reduce mind to its own explanatory abstractions, which creates a paradox, which is the source of its hard problem. And then likewise, the fundamental problem with dualism is that it tries to make the mind interact with its own explanatory abstractions, which creates a paradox of interaction, which is called the interaction problem. The implication is that if matter exists, then it has no place in the mind, and vice versa. And so, summary of this so far. So, we identified the dichotomy between matter and mind, and went over ways one can actually ignore this dichotomy. We addressed why idealism and physicalism are mirror ontologies, but why idealism is simpler as an ontology, since it doesn't make the additional assumption of matter in order to explain consciousness. It simply just takes consciousness as primary, and that's it. When two concepts are symmetric, it means knowledge of one implies knowledge of the other. We know about the hard problem of consciousness and explaining how the mental is reduced to the physical, but we also know, because of this problem, then we know that there is no problem with saying that the physical reduces to the mental. And so we argued that as a counter to what some physicalists say, which is in this case would be eliminative materialists, that rather than mind being a byproduct of language, it is in fact matter that is the true byproduct of language, due to language itself depending on knowledge, and likewise knowledge itself depends on mental states and not physical states. And so therefore, given these reasons, matter is an abstraction of mind, which means that the existence of matter, or a world outside consciousness, is not an empirical fact. Rather, it is the extra assumption in the explanatory model of physicalism and dualism, which comes in addition to the explanation of the mind under these ontologies. Of course, the problem is, once we apply Occam's razor, then we see that since idealism does not require the extra assumption of this extra assumption of matter, then idealism has a simpler explanatory model and therefore should be preferred over these alternative ontologies, simply because it is a simpler explanation of the world. And so that will be my video. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.